The Fairview County Animal Shelter held its adoption events on the second Saturday of every month, in the gravel lot behind the county building, and it was there on a cold morning in March that Josephine Bell first saw the puppy nobody wanted. He was a scrawny thing, maybe 5 months old, some indeterminate mix of shepherd and something smaller. With one ear that stood up and one that had never learned to, and a back left leg that did not move the way a leg was supposed to move, a birth defect. The shelter volunteer explained, a malformed joint that gave him a rolling, uneven gait, half walk and half hop, the kind of movement that made some people wince and look away before they had even finished looking. His shelter card read, Gus. Age, approx. 5 months. Notes, hind leg deformity, limited mobility. Temperament, sweet, timid, has been passed over several times. Josephine was 61 years old, recently widowed, living alone for the first time in 34 years in a house that had gone very quiet since her husband Harold's heart had given out the previous summer. She had come to the adoption event telling herself she wanted a normal dog, nothing complicated, the kind of sentence people say right before their plans are overruled by something they had not accounted for. She crouched by Gus's pen for a long time. He did not bound toward her the way the other puppies bounded toward everyone. He watched her, cautious, his crooked leg tucked slightly beneath him, and when she finally reached her hand through the fence, he pressed his nose into her palm with a gentleness that felt, to Josephine, like being chosen rather than choosing. She adopted him that afternoon. Her daughter Renee was not pleased. Renee lived 40 minutes away, visited on Sundays, and had strong opinions about what her recently widowed mother should and should not be taking on. Mom, a dog with a bad leg is going to mean vet bills you don't need right now. You could have picked literally any of the other ones. Josephine said, he picked me. Renee said, dogs don't pick people, Mom. That's not how it works. It was Renee's husband, though, who said the thing that stayed with Josephine longest. At a family dinner 2 weeks later, watching Gus limp across the kitchen floor to his water bowl, he said, not unkindly but not thinking either, you really went and got the broken one, huh? The word sat in the room the way certain words do, longer than the sentence around them. Josephine did not argue. She simply said, he's not broken. He just moves differently, and went back to setting the table, though something in her had quietly filed the comment away, the way people do with things that wound them but that they've decided not to make a scene about. Over the following months, Gus grew from an awkward, uncertain puppy into an awkward, uncertain adolescent dog. Still limping. Still favoring the leg, but confident now in Josephine's house, familiar with its corners, devoted to her in the specific, watchful way that dogs raised by grieving people sometimes become, as though he understood, without being told, that his job was not simply to be a pet, but to be present. He had one habit that Josephine found strange at first. Whenever she sat down heavily or moved slowly or once, memorably, when she had a dizzy spell in the kitchen and had to grip the counter to steady herself, Gus would appear at her side immediately, pressing his body against her leg, staying there, alert, until whatever had passed, had passed. The dizzy spells had started that spring. Josephine mentioned them to her general practitioner, who ordered some routine blood work and told her, in the vague, reassuring language doctors use when they are not yet worried, that it was probably nothing. Stress, grief, perhaps her blood pressure medication needing adjustment. The humiliating moment. The one Josephine would later describe as the turning point, though she did not recognize it as one at the time, happened at her sister's 70th birthday party in June, in front of nearly 30 relatives, when Josephine brought Gus along because she had begun, without quite admitting it to herself, to feel uneasy leaving him behind. Her brother-in-law, a blunt man named Carl who had strong opinions delivered at full volume regardless of audience, watched Gus limp his way across the backyard toward the dessert table and said, loudly enough for half the party to hear, Joe, Why on earth would you adopt a broken dog when there were probably 20 healthy ones sitting right next to him? That thing can barely walk. What's he supposed to do? Protect you? There was a ripple of uncomfortable laughter, the kind people produce when they don't want to be seen agreeing but also don't want to be seen defending. Josephine felt her face go hot. She said, quietly, "He's not for protecting me, Carl. He's just my dog." And she took her plate and sat at the far end of the table, and Gus, without being called, limped over and sat pressed against her leg for the rest of the afternoon, and she did not know, in that moment, that he was doing exactly the thing that would matter more than anything else anyone said that day. 3 weeks later, on a Tuesday afternoon in July, Josephine was alone in her kitchen when Gus began behaving in a way he never had before. He paced. He whined. He pressed against her leg and then backed away and barked. Short and insistent, then pressed against her again, refusing to settle, refusing to let her walk past him toward the hallway. Josephine, mildly annoyed and mostly confused, called her vet's office to ask if this was some kind of behavioral issue she should be concerned about, and the receptionist, hearing the details, suggested she bring him in that same afternoon since there'd been a cancellation. The veterinarian who saw them was Dr. Amara Ndiaye, a woman in her 40s who had run the Fairview Animal Clinic for over a decade and who had, in that time, developed a reputation for taking dog behavior more seriously than most of her colleagues did. She watched Gus pace the exam room, watched him press repeatedly against Josephine's side, watched him refuse to disengage even when Josephine sat down. And she asked, almost offhandedly, "Has anything felt off with you lately, Mrs. Bell? Dizziness, fatigue, anything like that?" Josephine mentioned the dizzy spells, the blood work that had come back inconclusive, the vague reassurance from her doctor. Dr. Ndiaye grew quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Does he do this? The pacing, the pressing against you at any particular times? Before the dizzy spells happen? Or after?" Josephine thought back, genuinely trying to remember, and found to her own surprise that she could recall 3 separate occasions where Gus had grown agitated in exactly this way 10 or 15 minutes before a dizzy spell arrived. Dr. Ndiaye said, "Mrs. Bell, I don't want to alarm you, but I've seen this before, and I want to be direct with you. Some dogs, not all, and we don't fully understand the mechanism, though there's growing research on scent-based detection of blood sugar and blood pressure changes, some dogs can detect physiological shifts in a person before the person themselves is symptomatic. It shows up as exactly this kind of behavior: pacing, pressing against the person, refusing to let them out of reach. It's the same mechanism behind diabetic alert dogs, though this looks like it might be something cardiac or vascular given what you've described. I think what your dog has been doing, possibly for weeks, is warning you before these episodes happen." Josephine sat with this for a long moment, one hand resting on Gus's head, who had finally settled now that they were both sitting still. Dr. Ndiaye recommended, given what she was hearing, that Josephine see a cardiologist rather than wait on her general practitioner's wait-and-see approach, and she said it with enough seriousness that Josephine made the appointment that same week rather than putting it off. The cardiologist found what the earlier blood work had missed: an arrhythmia, intermittent and difficult to catch on a standard test, the kind that could, left unaddressed, lead to a fainting episode at an inconvenient moment, on stairs, while driving, alone in the house. She was fitted with a monitor, then scheduled for a procedure that corrected it 3 weeks later, and her cardiologist told her plainly that catching it now, before a serious fall, or worse, had very likely spared her a hospitalization that could have gone a great deal differently for a woman living alone. When Josephine told her family what had happened, what Gus had been doing all along, unnoticed, unremarked upon, dismissed at a birthday party as a dog who could barely walk, the reaction in the room was different this time. Carl, to his credit, did not attempt to defend what he'd said in June. He simply looked at the dog, now dozing at Josephine's feet with his crooked leg splayed out beside him, and said, "I owe you an apology, buddy," which was as close to contrition as Carl had ever been known to offer anyone, animal or otherwise. Renee, for her part, drove over that weekend and sat on the kitchen floor with Gus for a long while, scratching behind his lopsided ear, and told her mother she was sorry for the vet bill comment. Though what she said afterward mattered more, I think he knew what he was for before any of us did. Josephine still corrects people, gently, when they call Gus's leg a flaw, or a defect, or, as Carl once had, broken. She tells them what she has come to believe fully, in the specific, unhurried way of someone who has been proven right by circumstance rather than argument, that a body can move unevenly and still be exactly complete, that the parts of a creature people are quickest to write off are sometimes the very parts holding everything else together, and that the dog nobody wanted at the Fairview County shelter had spent 5 months learning to walk on a leg that didn't work quite right, only to spend every day since making sure that hers kept working at all.